Chapter 15. On the Run. Reflecting on the events of the last few days and what it had taken to board the cargo ship he was now on, the American wondered what was in store for him next. Never before in his long career with the CIA had a mission gone wrong as the one he was now trying to escape from. Always having multiple ways out of the country of operation was the one thing his mentor had ensured he learned. Now he understood why, as one by one they vanished, along with the power of the United States during the EMP detonation. Those with whom he had made arrangements knew their deals were of no consequence and had either refused to assist him or tried to set him up with the Chinese. Now here he was, staring out over the deck of the Chinese military cargo vessel from between two rolls of shipping containers. The ship was still marked as civilian transport, even though it was clearly carrying military supplies across the Yellow Sea to Korea or heading across the Pacific to the United States. Keeping to the darker parts of the ship, he was able to survive without being seen, and he hoped that the ship was indeed going the full distance, but only time would tell. Satisfied that there were no search parties looking for him on board, he returned to a tight and very uncomfortable void between the decks. Inside, the hours passed as the American contemplated just where he had failed to recognize the flaw in the mission, and without making any progress, he slumped off to sleep. Awakened by men screaming and the echo of boots striking the steel inches above him, the American looked to the watch on his wrist. Seeing rays of light making their way through the cracks, he was a little puzzled by the time. He felt like he had slept for a great number of hours, but that didn't add up to the 10 minutes that had passed according to his watch. The more he thought about it, the stranger the situation felt. And again he looked at his watch, thinking that maybe he had looked at it incorrectly. Again, only 10 minutes had passed, but this time he looked at the date. The little white dial read 17. Now, instead of being confused, he could feel a slight panic come over him as he realized, due to the stress and 2 days without sleep, he had slept for 24 hours. Hearing the boots as they became closer, he wondered if somehow they had discovered he was on board and now searched for him. Slowly he moved from the void and made his way back to the deck above, while working his way from one spot to the next without being spotted. Quickly he noticed every man on board held a rifle, or was engaged with setting up a rocket system from where they had pulled it from one of the lower containers. "Okay, guess that isn't for me," the American said, as he moved to a better location in hopes of spotting what had the crew so active. With the crew alert, each position he moved to was planned out carefully. Nearing the front of the ship, he heard steel being ripped and twisted as the crew screamed. Then, from high in the sky above, he heard a sound he knew well, the sound of gods farting. Looking up, he could see the smoke ring as another A-10 Warthog released the power of its 30mm gun, causing much the same devastation aboard the vessel. Watching the A-10 pull up from its dive, he hoped that if they made a third pass, he didn't get caught up in its wake. Looking off into the distance, the American could see what had startled the crew, prompting them to drop their facade that they were merely a commercial vessel. Without much effort, he could make out a U.S. heavy cruiser alongside a Japanese warship as they quickly approached the slow-moving vessel. To the American, it appeared the two warships could easily eliminate the vessel from underneath his feet, but instead they chose to capture it for its cargo. In a time of war, you took supplies where you could get them, and it looked as if the two warships were going to not only capture supplies, but also save his life in the process, and he was going to do everything in his power to ensure that happened. Scanning the sky for any signs of the A-10 Warthogs, the American didn't just watch, but listened for the slightest trace of its engines. Fairly certain he at least wouldn't be shredded by the warplane, he began climbing down from the containers at the front of the ship, careful not to stretch his right side out too far due to the bullet wound he had suffered in Beijing. Approaching the area where the rocket system had been preparing to launch, he could see the A-10 pilot had done his job, not with just the personnel setting it up, but with the system itself. All through it were 30mm bullet holes, and not just through it, but through everything in the area, including the deck he stood on. In many areas, the ship just looked like a jagged tin can that had been opened with a pocket knife. While admiring the work the A-10 had done, the American heard a noise coming from a container a few rows down. Catching him by surprise, a Chinese soldier exited with his rifle slung over his shoulder as he pulled on a rope running to the inside of the container. Quickly, the American scanned the nearby area for a weapon. Seeing an AK-47 just a few feet away, he ran to it just as the soldier spotted him and dropped the rope. With the rifle on the deck lying between him and the soldier, the American only slightly slowed down as he scooped it from the deck. Caught by surprise at the sight of the American, the Chinese soldier was now fumbling to bring up the rifle to fire. With precise movements, the American ensured the rifle had a round chambered, ready to fire. Pulling back on the bolt, he ejected one, but it was replaced by another. As he performed the action, he never took his eyes off the target. Raising the rifle up to his shoulder, he knew it was time to send the bullet into the chest of the soldier in front of him. With his fingers wrapped around the grip and the index finger extended out, he slid the finger down to the trigger to fire the bullet, only his finger found no trigger. While continuing to close the distance between himself and the soldier, he turned the rifle and glanced down. "Unbelievable," the American said to himself as he saw where the trigger had been removed by a round from the A-10 passing cleanly through. Now only a few powerful strides away from the soldier, he watched the soldier's rifle move in his direction, but he was too slow. On his last step to the soldier, the American thrust the damaged AK-47 from his shoulder with his right hand, placing the barrel into the soldier's throat. With his free left hand, he reached out and grabbed the soldier's rifle as he seemed to curl up in midair, clutching his throat. From inside the container, gunfire erupted. Knowing the clumsy soldier most likely wasn't alone, the American had already begun dropping to the deck. With his momentum carrying him past the open door, he rolled over the top of the soldier, pulling his rifle free, worked the bolt back, pulled it up to his shoulder, and then rolled back into the opening while pulling the trigger. With the container only about 8 feet wide inside, he made small circle patterns as he kept the trigger pulled, firing every round inside. With the bolt locked open, the American jumped to his feet and ran inside, not only to be sure he had killed the occupants, but also to gather ammunition from them. With the rocket system secure, and those inside no longer with the living, the American began searching the decks of the large vessel for any threat to him being rescued. With each corner turned, he scanned for targets to eliminate, but found mostly only piles of flesh or men with body parts missing from the high-velocity 30mm rounds striking them. When a 30mm round makes contact with a human body, it wasn't the material itself passing through, but the speed and spin in which it does, causing everything around it to be thrust outwards. Those features taking place in the body caused it to pop, just like a water balloon encountering a porcupine. "Don't move!" a voice demanded, and instantly relief came over him as he lowered his weapon at the sound of an American voice. Happily, he responded by placing the AK-47 onto the ground and then doing the same thing. Lying face down on the still deck with his hands clasped together behind him, he felt the soldiers wasting no time in placing zip cuffs on and pulling them tight around his wrists. "Who are you, and what are you doing on board this vessel?" one of the soldiers inquired. "I am—" He stopped and thought about the question and how he should answer. It was something that he had never wondered before, but now the world was much different. Before he had finished thinking about how to respond, the soldier asked him once again, "Who are you, and what are you doing on board?" "I am Adam Rayner of the Central Intelligence Agency, and I request you take me to whoever is in charge." Adam couldn't believe how strange it felt to tell somebody the truth about who he was and where he worked. Throughout his long career, he was sure those words had never passed through his lips. Not surprised by the answer to his question, the soldier responded, "Well, Mr. Rayner, I am sure they are going to have plenty of questions for you." Adams quickly found himself sitting in the brig aboard their U.S. Navy vessel. Looking at his watch for the 100th time, Adam watched the hours pass. Normally, it would have bothered him, being locked in the brig of a ship when he would have already begun making plans to escape. But not this time. This time, Adam just sat and waited, secure in the thought that he was once again in the company of Americans. With his time not spent on seeking out ways to stay alive, he had much more pleasant thoughts such as how he would one day kill Chi. A few more hours passed before the rhythmic sounds of the ship were disturbed by the clanking of the latch on the brig door. As it opened, he noticed the markings of the captain before anything else. "Mr. Rayner, my name is Samuel Johnson. I am the captain of the USS Forrest Sherman, which you have been brought aboard. Now that you know who I am and where you are, how about you explain just how you became a passenger on a Chinese military supply vessel?" Adam remained on the bunk as Captain Johnson spoke, thinking of how his web of lies would begin, and just how strange it was to hear his name spoken. "Screw it. Let's try the truth, but maybe leave a few parts out, like starting the entire collapse of the United States." Sitting up and making eye contact with the captain, Adam began, "Well, Captain, I was on the run from my Chinese counterpart, who killed my team and did his best to kill me." Adam went on for about 10 minutes, covering everything from his relationship with Chi, through his many failed escape routes, and ending with, "Now I am sitting here explaining it all to you." Believing most of what he had just heard, Captain Johnson looked to the guard and ordered, "Remove the cuffs." Standing up, Adam pulled his hands free of the zip-tie cuffs and held them out to the guard, saying, "No need. Here you go." Then he walked toward the door. By the time they arrived at the war room where Adam hoped to find out just how bad things had got in the world, he had seen a great deal of the ship. From what he could tell, it was business as usual. Everywhere men and women moved about the ship conducting maintenance and inspections, all to ensure the ship was ready for their next encounter. "Right in here, Mr. Rayner," the guard directed, still slightly irritated from the zip cuff incident. Nodding his head, Adam walked into a room full of monitors with very little on them. Many even had their power cords dangling from the wall. In the middle of the room sat a large, table-like structure that had obviously been recently installed. Every inch of it was covered with maps of different regions with many colored post-its placed about. On one of them, Adam noticed a thick red line running diagonally across the name USS Theodore Roosevelt. Quickly, Adam's eyes moved to another with the same red line across USS George H.W. Bush. Each post-it he spotted had the same markings. "What is this, Captain?" Adam said, hoping it was not as it appeared. With a deep breath, Captain Johnson sighed as he replied, "Those, Mr. Rayner, are the grave sites of thousands of men and women of the U.S. Navy." It took a great deal to shock Adam after years in the CIA, but what he just heard and what he stared at was hard for him to take. How? There are so many. Looking around the room at all the electronics being used, the captain began, "From what we can tell, they used the electronics." Instantly, Adam remarked, "That is not possible. There is no way they could have hacked the computers of all those ships. They are equipped with the highest encryption available." Turning his attention from the surrounding room to the CIA agent, he replied, "Mr. Rayner, you are correct. They didn't hack the computers. We were only a few miles away from the USS Ronald Reagan when it was destroyed in a matter of seconds with what we could only surmise to be hypersonic missiles. You see, Mr. Rayner, there was no need to hack the computers. They simply targeted the computers themselves, computers with chips made in China.